Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We will look in this presentation into one of those examples when sanctions can be relevant for the life of every person. And more specifically, we will look into the issue of traveling for personal purposes from the European Union or the United Kingdom to Russia or Belarus and bringing cash for personal purposes. Something which is more and more relevant today given the general disruption of normal payments by credit card or bank transfers between these jurisdictions. And we will look into those restrictions, which are potentially, to the surprise of many travelers, are in place with respect to bringing cash, even when for personal purposes. We would look into the activities which potentially fall within the restrictions, and we will focus on the personal use exemption by explaining its narrow scope and the activities which may potentially result in the breach of sanctions. So both the European Union and the UK sanctions have a prohibition which is specifically related to cash, and more specifically bringing cash to Russia or Belarus for any purpose. So the prohibition is drafted in a very general way, and as a general matter, it's prohibited to bring cash to those jurisdictions. Under normal circumstances, this probably would not be an issue at all, and it would be one of those irrelevant restrictions which are there but create no problems. But in 2026, when the payment systems between both countries are, as a matter of fact, non-existent, for many people who cannot afford having third-party jurisdiction bank accounts, bringing modest amounts of cash is the only viable option to travel back to the country where persons may have family or close family members. So for those people, the restriction is relevant because the prohibition is in place, and the only exemption from that very prohibition is actually the use for personal use purposes when traveling to those two countries. In the UK, the prohibition is even broader, and there is first of all a cap of £10,000 equivalent, whereby even for personal use purpose exemptions, the cash may not be brought to those jurisdictions. And second of all, the exemption goes as far as to cover providing cash for a person connected with Russia, even outside of the Russian territory. So technically speaking, if a person is permanently resident in Russia and is visiting you in UK, and you withdraw cash from an ATM and give to this person for whatever purposes, this is an offense. So let's first of all look at the activities which will fall within this restriction. Traveling with cash is certainly fall within this restriction, and as I mentioned, is relevant for many persons as a practical matter. Indirect traveling, meaning traveling through a third-party jurisdiction, which is common today, given the absence of direct flights between the European Union and Russia, would fall within the restriction. So if you follow, for example, the normal way of going to Russia through Turkey, United Arab Emirates, or the countries in the Caucasus, this type of traveling will fall within the restriction, and it's likely that at the customs you may face issues if you bring cash and your ultimate end destination is Russia. Sending cash by post will fall within the restriction. Conversely, the restriction applies only to the currency of the EU member states, or in the case of the UK and the EU member states, so we talk about euro, British pound, or those currencies of the EU member states which still have their national currency, like Denmark, Sweden, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, or Romania. And the most notable exception from here would be US dollars, which do not fall within the restrictions. So technically speaking, if a person is bringing US dollars as cash when traveling to Russia or Belarus, this will fall outside of the restriction altogether. The only note of caution here is that the anti-circumvention clause is there and is quite creatively applied in various circumstances. So bringing a substantial amount of US dollars may potentially result in the customs authorities raising the issue of sanctions circumvention. It's also important to note that the matter applies only to cash. So for example, checks, although not that common in the European Union, will fall outside of the restriction. So as we saw, the main exemption from this very broad prohibition is a personal use exemption. And the personal use exemption is set out in the regulation that any personal use when traveling to Russia is outside of the restriction altogether. So one might think that personal use purposes are exempt, and from that purpose, to the extent you are not using cash for business or investment purposes, you're outside of the scope, and it should not create any kind of practical problems. Whilst it's difficult to clearly draw a line between what is investment or professional purposes or personal use purposes in certain circumstances, for example, if a person would like to buy a very expensive painting, whether it's done for personal use purposes or whether it's done for investment purposes, is maybe borderline to decide. One would certainly say that, for example, using cash for medical treatment is clearly a personal purpose. There is no investment or professional element in this type of spending by anybody's standards. And one may also think of very good reasons why a person would wish to go to Russia, for example, assuming that the person left Russia recently and still has good relationship with his or her doctors there, or needs to undergo a very complex surgery and trust a specific doctor to do the surgery. So there are very valid reasons why a person may wish to travel back to Russia to have medical treatment there. And we can certainly give many other examples unrelated to the circumstances which are borderline, which are clearly personal type of transactions. And so the common thinking was that the personal use exemption will certainly allow this type of spendings and will allow bring cash to Russia for this type of spendings. Taking into account that should financial and banking sector work as it did before, there is no real prohibition to pay for any of these services by a credit card or by a bank transfer from the European Union to Russia. This is, however, not the way how the European Court of Justice interpreted the relevant provision on the application of a national court. It's important to bring the facts of the case to understand the matter. Actually, a person traveled to Russia specifically for medical treatment. She wanted to have dental treatment in Russia, as well as some follow-up on the surgery she had. For that purpose, she was bringing the equivalent of approximately 15,000 euros in cash, an amount which is certainly commensurate to a complex medical treatment the person wanted to undergo in Russia. And the interpretation given by the court with respect to the use of cash for medical purposes was that this is not the personal use exemption as set out in the regulation, because the exemption has to be interpreted as applying only to those expenses which are specifically necessary for travel, meaning travel expenses, paying for tickets, accommodation, subsistence, but nothing more than that. It's a very narrow interpretation of the relevant exemption. One would argue, say, inconsistent with how the regulation was drafted, because it doesn't say travel-related expenses. It says personal use expenses for people traveling to Russia. But nevertheless, that is the law, and that's how the exemption has to apply. Applying it to personal needs, one can see that, for example, bringing cash to Russia for medical services or any other type of services unrelated to traveling itself is prohibited, as well as it's prohibited to bring cash to pay for goods which are not inherently linked to traveling, which in the interpretation of the court, in essence, means food. So, formally speaking, even, for example, buying souvenirs when traveling to Russia is not permitted with cash, and it's not possible to justify bringing cash on these bases. Leaving souvenirs aside, which is probably the example used by me to illustrate the inexplicable narrow interpretation given to this provision by the judiciary, and going more to more practical examples, certainly bringing cash to support your family members or, for example, close friends in Russia will fall outside of the exemption and is prohibited. Again, in the context of today's world, certainly many people will open accounts in the third-party jurisdictions like Central Asian republics, Turkey, Middle East, can make transfers through those third-party jurisdictions which do not pose restrictions in Russia. But certainly these type of transactions are available and affordable only for a group of persons of some reasonable wealth. For most of the people who would like to support their family and friends with modest means, it would be certainly prohibitively expensive to open these type of accounts for the purpose of these modest transfers and to pay all the fees and charges related to these transfers. And accordingly, that means that, as we saw many times with other examples, the sanctions seem to target the most vulnerable, a group of people who cannot afford other means of transfers. Similarly, for example, if a person would like, for various reasons, including the insolvency or closure of business, to relocate back to Russia or Belarus and to bring his savings back, which may be modest in their amount and accordingly would not really justify the complex third-party accounts structures we've discussed, this person would not be permitted to bring this cash back to Russia because this type of transfer of cash will not be directly linked to covering the traveling expenses and accordingly will fall outside of the scope of the restriction. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.